In this chapter, we're going to cover two important aspects of hacking an organization. That's web server attacks and web application attacks. Frequently, the target of websites is to deface them or get data from the application or the underlying databases. But you have to go through the server first, and attacking a server is a lot like attacking another server that runs different services like DNS or SMTP and so forth. They're all susceptible to the same kind of attacks. Now, web servers are frequently attacked because of their public, internet-facing nature. They sit on the internet, possibly in our demilitarized zone, but they are accessible by people on the internet for a good reason. We want information to be out there. We want to be able to provide it to our customers and our employees in the case of remote applications that they might use to log their timesheets, for example, or access other data. Now, web server hacks basically are the first step in getting to the website or the web application itself in order to do evil things to it, deface it, or get data off of it. Now, web servers are prone typically to the same types of attacks that other kinds of servers suffer. In other words, if you had an SMTP server or a DNS server and so forth, there are a few basic attacks that any server could suffer. Obviously, because of the nature of what it does, there are some specific attacks you would wage against a web server versus a DNS server, for example. But, by and large, attacks that affect the operating system and the hardware itself are almost the same. Denial of service attacks, DNS poisoning attacks, for example, attacking weak or poor configuration settings on a server, poor patching practices, and so forth. Those are all things that most servers suffer from. Now, web servers also, unfortunately, may offer an entryway into an organization's internal network if they're not configured and secured properly. So, in addition to getting to the application and getting to the data on the web server, hackers could use the web server as a jumping point to get inside the organization's network. So that's something we have to think about as well. Now, web server attacks, which is what we're going to be talking about for the next few sessions, can be implemented using some of the same methods as other server attacks. And we're talking things like network attacks, where we might attack different services, port scan, look at different protocols that are unsecure, for example. We also might look at configuration attacks. How is the server, particularly its operating system and application, configured? Is it secure? Are there default passwords on there? Are there blank passwords for some of the user accounts? Are the shares and files and folders locked down? So those are some of the things we may attack any server with. We also look at things, vulnerabilities that might be on the box, like unpatched software or unpatched operating systems. Poor authentication methods such as simple password authentication and maybe password policies that don't involve complex passwords or lengthy passwords might be something we would target. And again, improperly set permissions on files and folders and other types of shares that are on the box might be something that a hacker would target. Some of the things that we might look at specifically for a web server, and some of these are very generic and some of these are specific to web servers, are default configuration. In other words, how did it get configured after it was installed right out of the box? Did it get locked down, or is it still in its default state? Any default files that might be out there. A lot of web server applications like Apache and IIS use default files and default directory structures. That, unfortunately, if not locked down, could leave the web server wide open to attack. Unnecessary services on the box might be an issue. If you're running a web server, do you really need DNS as a server service running, or SMTP? A lot of these relate to multi-purpose boxes. A lot of people, because of a budget or because of the need to have multiple services out there on the internet, may put multiple services on them, a web server, an email server, and so forth. Unfortunately, that opens up the box to a wide range of attacks. What you want to do is minimize the attack surface by minimizing what runs on the box. Lack of port filtering, and this may not be something that's done by the box itself. It may be something that should be done by an external router or external firewall. But if you don't filter these ports, and ports are open that shouldn't be, well, then you've left yourself open to a couple of attacks. Unpatched applications and operating systems may allow vulnerabilities that are either zero-day or, even worse possibly, vulnerabilities that have been out there for a while, wide open and susceptible to attack. File and directory permissions. Having it so everyone can read or write to a directory would be a bad thing, because a hacker could upload malicious software or viruses to an open directory, or they could access and read files they shouldn't read from a directory. Simple or default passwords obviously is an issue. If you have passwords that aren't configured or are blank or don't meet complexity requirements, then those are easy targets for web server hacking. Also, lack of authentication or weak authentication mechanisms. Using weak protocols or using weak authentication methods might be an issue. It's something that the web server would be susceptible to attack through. Any unsecured connection with other hosts. A lot of times, if you can get into a web server, it may not have a secure connection to another host, or it may have a trusted connection to another host. And if that's the case, you can bounce from that compromised web server to another host and on into the internal network. SSL certificate issues could also be an avenue to attack the web server with. It could be an expired certificate or a self-generated certificate or a certificate that's been compromised. Any of these issues could be a problem. Weak operational security, and this might be administrators not performing backups on a regular basis or not going through a security checklist, for example, could be an avenue into attack the web server as well. And finally, no security devices. In other words, putting a web server out there where there's no border router and no firewall would definitely be a way for a hacker to take advantage of that server and completely take it over eventually. So these are some of the things that a hacker definitely thinks about and a defender also needs to think about, and we're going to talk about some of these as we go through the next few sessions.